In the remote and rugged Central Highlands of Vietnam, where mist clings to ancient mountains and dense jungle conceals hidden valleys, there lived a people who would become some of America's most loyal and courageous allies during the Vietnam War. They were called Montagnards, a French word meaning mountain people. To the Vietnamese, they were known as Dagar, meaning sons of the mountains. But these names barely begin to capture who these people really were, what they sacrificed, and why their story remains one of the most compelling and tragic chapters of the entire Vietnam conflict. The Montagnards were not a single tribe or ethnic group. They were dozens of distinct indigenous peoples, each with their own language, customs, and traditions. The Jarai, the Raid, the Coho, the Bachnar, the Sedang, and many others. Some anthropologists estimated there were more than 30 separate Montagnard groups living in the Central Highlands. They had inhabited these mountains for thousands of years, long before the Vietnamese came from the north, long before the French arrived with their colonial ambitions, and certainly long before American soldiers would set foot in their villages. These were traditional societies, living close to the land in ways that had changed little over centuries. They practiced slash and burn agriculture, cultivating rice in the valleys and on terraced hillsides. They hunted in the forests with crossbows and spears. They lived in longhouses built on stilts, entire extended families under one roof. Their villages were tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else, where tradition and custom governed daily life, where the spirits of ancestors watched over the living. The Montagnards had their own complex religious beliefs, animistic traditions that saw spiritual forces in the natural world. The forests and rivers, the mountains and valleys, all were inhabited by spirits that had to be respected and appeased. Shamans and village elders performed rituals and ceremonies to maintain harmony between the human and spirit worlds. These beliefs were fundamental to Montagnard identity and shaped every aspect of their lives. For generations, the Montagnards had lived largely independent of lowland Vietnamese control. The mountains were their domain, and the Vietnamese who lived in the coastal plains and river deltas had little interest in the rugged highlands. There was minimal contact between these two very different peoples, and when contact did occur, it was often hostile. The Vietnamese looked down on the Montagnards as primitive savages. The Montagnards viewed the Vietnamese as invaders and oppressors. This mutual antagonism had deep historical roots. Over centuries, as Vietnamese kingdoms expanded southward from the Red River Delta, they pushed into territories inhabited by various indigenous peoples. The Montagnards retreated into the highlands, the least accessible and least desirable land, where they could maintain their independence. But even in the mountains, they were not entirely free from Vietnamese interference. Lowland Vietnamese occasionally raided Montagnard villages for slaves or to extract tribute. The Montagnards learned to distrust and fear the Vietnamese. When the French colonized Vietnam in the 19th century, they found the Montagnards to be useful allies against Vietnamese resistance. The French played on the historic tensions between the two groups. They recruited Montagnards into colonial military units and gave them a degree of autonomy in the highlands. French missionaries converted some Montagnards to Christianity, adding another layer of distinction between them and the predominantly Buddhist Vietnamese. Under French rule, the Montagnards experienced a period of relative protection and stability, though they remained economically marginalized and politically powerless. The French colonial period introduced the Montagnards to modern weapons and military training. French officers recognized that the Montagnards were natural warriors. They were tough, accustomed to hardship, familiar with the jungle terrain, and fiercely loyal once their trust was earned. The French formed Montagnard units that proved effective in maintaining colonial control over the highlands and fighting against Vietnamese nationalist movements. When the French were finally defeated and withdrew from Vietnam in 1954, the Montagnards found themselves in a precarious position. Vietnam was divided into communist North and anti-communist South. The Central Highlands fell under the control of South Vietnam, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem. The Montagnards hoped that the new South Vietnamese government would respect their autonomy and traditional way of life. They were quickly disappointed. The Diem regime viewed the Montagnards with the same contempt that Vietnamese had historically shown toward the Highland peoples. Diem's government implemented policies designed to assimilate the Montagnards into Vietnamese culture. They were pressured to abandon their traditional customs, to adopt Vietnamese language and dress, to resettle in government-controlled areas. Montagnard lands were seized for Vietnamese colonization projects. Thousands of lowland Vietnamese were resettled into the highlands, taking over land that Montagnards had cultivated for generations. These policies created deep resentment among the Montagnards. They felt betrayed by the government they had been told to support. Some Montagnards began to resist South Vietnamese authority. There were protests and occasional violent confrontations. The South Vietnamese military responded with harsh repression, further alienating the Montagnard population. By the early 1960s, many Montagnards were deeply hostile to the Saigon government. This situation presented both problems and opportunities for the United States as it increased its involvement in Vietnam. American officials recognized that the Central Highlands were strategically crucial. The region bordered Laos and Cambodia, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the communist supply route from North Vietnam to the south, ran through the highlands. Whoever controlled the highlands controlled access to South Vietnam's interior. The Montagnards, with their knowledge of the terrain and their hostility to both the North Vietnamese communists and the South Vietnamese government, represented a potential ally. But winning Montagnard trust would not be easy. The Montagnards had been betrayed and exploited by outsiders for generations. They had no reason to believe that the Americans would be any different. What the Montagnards wanted was simple. They wanted to be left alone to live their traditional way of life on their ancestral lands. They wanted protection from Vietnamese encroachment, whether from the communist North or the supposedly friendly South. They wanted respect for their culture and autonomy. The Americans who would eventually forge the alliance with the Montagnards were a unique group of soldiers and intelligence officers. Many were special forces, the Green Berets, men who had been trained in unconventional warfare and working with indigenous populations. These were not conventional soldiers. They were trained to live among local populations, to learn their languages and customs, to build trust and train local forces to fight alongside American units. The man who would become most closely associated with the Montagnards and the Central Highlands was a special forces officer named David Nuttall. But before Nuttall and others like him arrived, the groundwork for the American Montagnard Alliance was being laid by intelligence officers working for the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA saw the potential of using Montagnard fighters in unconventional warfare against the communist forces infiltrating through the highlands. In 1961, the CIA began experimenting with small Montagnard militias in the Central Highlands. The initial programs were modest, training small groups of Montagnards in basic military skills and providing them with weapons to defend their villages against Viet Cong infiltration. The results were promising. The Montagnards proved to be eager learners and effective fighters when properly trained and equipped. More importantly, they were willing to work with Americans in ways they never would with the South Vietnamese. What made the difference was respect. The American Special Forces soldiers who worked with the Montagnards treated them as equals and partners, not as primitives to be looked down upon. The Green Berets lived in Montagnard villages, ate Montagnard food, learned Montagnard languages, and participated in Montagnard customs and ceremonies. They showed genuine interest in Montagnard culture and demonstrated that they valued the Montagnards as people, not just as tools to be used and discarded. This approach was revolutionary in the context of Vietnam. The South Vietnamese military and government had always treated the Montagnards with contempt and suspicion. The Americans offered something different, partnership based on mutual respect. The Montagnards responded to this approach with enthusiasm and loyalty that would endure through years of brutal warfare. The program that would formalize this alliance was called the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, known by its acronym CIDG. Launched in 1962, the CIDG program aimed to organize Montagnard villagers into armed militias capable of defending their communities against Viet Cong attack and providing intelligence on communist movement through the highlands. The program was initially run by the CIA, but was transferred to the U.S. Army Special Forces in 1963. Under the CIDG program, American Special Forces teams, typically 12 men, would move into a Montagnard area and establish a camp. The camp would serve as a base for training local fighters and as a defensive position to protect nearby villages. The Americans would recruit Montagnard men into the program, train them in weapons, tactics, and small unit operations, and then lead them on patrols and operations against communist forces. The first CIDG camp was established at Buonanao in Darlac Province in 1961. The camp was built in raid territory, and the raid proved to be enthusiastic participants in the program. Within months, hundreds of raid fighters had been recruited and trained. The Buonanao camp became a model for the CIDG program, and similar camps were soon established throughout the Central Highlands. The Special Forces soldiers who ran these camps quickly learned that working with the Montagnards required patience, cultural sensitivity, and genuine respect. The Montagnards had their own way of doing things, their own concepts of honor and loyalty, their own military traditions. The Americans had to adapt to Montagnard culture, rather than trying to force the Montagnards to adopt American military culture wholesale. For example, the Montagnards had traditional practices around warfare that seemed strange to American soldiers. Before going into battle, Montagnard warriors would perform elaborate rituals to gain the favor of the spirits. They would sacrifice animals and drink rice wine. They believed that brass bracelets would protect them from bullets. Some Americans initially dismissed these practices as superstition, but the smarter Special Forces soldiers recognized that these traditions were important to Montagnard morale and identity. Instead of trying to eliminate these practices, they incorporated them into operations. The Americans also had to understand Montagnard social structures. Villages were led by chiefs and councils of elders. These leaders had to be consulted and respected. Decisions couldn't simply be imposed from above. The Americans learned to work through traditional Montagnard leadership structures, rather than trying to create entirely new hierarchies. This approach took more time, but resulted in stronger, more cohesive units. Language was another challenge. The various Montagnard groups spoke different languages, and few spoke Vietnamese, let alone English. Some Special Forces soldiers made the effort to learn Montagnard languages, at least enough to communicate basic concepts. Others worked through interpreters. But even without perfect communication, the Americans and Montagnards found ways to understand each other, shared experiences in combat, created bonds that transcended language barriers. The living conditions in the CIDG camps were primitive by American standards. The camps were built in remote jungle locations, accessible only by helicopter or by days of hiking through difficult terrain. There was no electricity, no running water, no modern conveniences. The Americans lived as the Montagnards lived, in basic structures, eating local food, enduring the heat and insects and constant dampness of the jungle. This shared hardship created solidarity between the Americans and their Montagnard allies. As the CIDG program expanded, more Special Forces teams deployed to the Central Highlands. By the mid-1960s, there were dozens of CIDG camps scattered throughout the Highlands, manned by small American teams and hundreds of Montagnard fighters. These camps formed a network of defensive positions designed to monitor and interdict communist infiltration routes. The Montagnards who joined the CIDG were motivated by various factors. Some were primarily interested in protecting their villages from Viet Cong attack. The communists had been pressuring Montagnard villages, demanding food, recruits, and cooperation. Villages that faced retaliation. The CIDG offered protection and the means to resist communist coercion. Others were motivated by their hostility to the South Vietnamese government. They saw the Americans as potential protectors against both communist forces and South Vietnamese encroachment on their lands. The Americans promised to respect Montagnard autonomy and to help preserve their way of life. Many Montagnards believed, or hoped, that an American victory in the war would result in greater autonomy for the Highland peoples. Still others were motivated by the material benefits of joining the CIDG. Fighters received weapons, equipment, and regular pay. In the impoverished Highlands, this was significant. A CIDG service provided a steady income and access to medical care and other services that were otherwise unavailable. For some Montagnards, particularly younger men with few economic opportunities, the CIDG offered a path to a better life. But perhaps the strongest motivation was the respect and camaraderie they found with the American Special Forces. The Montagnards had been looked down upon and abused by Vietnamese for generations. The Americans treated them as warriors and equals. They trained alongside them, fought alongside them, and often died alongside them. The bonds formed between Special Forces soldiers and Montagnard fighters were deep and genuine. Many Special Forces veterans would later say that the Montagnards were the most loyal and courageous soldiers they had ever served with. The training provided through the CIDG program transformed the Montagnards into effective modern fighters while preserving their traditional warrior culture. The Americans taught them how to use modern weapons, including M16 rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. They taught small unit tactics, ambush techniques, patrol procedures, and radio communications. They taught basic first aid and battlefield medicine. But the Americans also recognized and built upon the skills the Montagnards already possessed. The Montagnards were masters of jungle survival. They could move through the densest jungle silently and swiftly. They could read signs in the forest that Americans couldn't see. They knew the terrain intimately, every trail and stream, every hill and valley. They had an almost supernatural ability to sense danger and detect enemy presence. These skills, combined with modern weapons and tactics, made them formidable fighters. The Montagnards also brought their traditional warrior ethos to the fight. They valued courage and honor above all else. They were willing to take risks that others wouldn't. They didn't quit when things got difficult, and they were fiercely protective of their families and villages. This combination of traditional warrior culture and modern military training created fighters who were both brave and effective. By 1964, the CIDG program had recruited and trained tens of thousands of Montagnard fighters. These men were organized into companies and battalions, led by American Special Forces advisors and Montagnard officers. They conducted operations throughout the Central Highlands, patrolling infiltration routes, gathering intelligence, and engaging communist forces. The operations conducted by CIDG units range from village defense to long-range reconnaissance patrols deep into enemy territory. Some CIDG companies were assigned to defend their camps and surrounding villages. Others conducted offensive operations, seeking out enemy units and supply caches. The most elite units, known as Mobile Strike Forces or Mike Forces, served as quick reaction forces, deploying by helicopter to reinforce camps under attack or to exploit intelligence about enemy activity. The Mike Forces represented the cream of the Montagnard fighters. These were the toughest, most experienced, and most highly trained fighters. They were organized into battalion-sized units and could be deployed anywhere in the Highlands on short notice. Mike Force operations were often dangerous and complex, involving helicopter assaults, ambushes deep in enemy territory, and sustained combat against well-armed communist forces. The Montagnards who served in the Mike Forces became legendary for their courage and skill. One of the most famous Montagnard leaders to emerge during this period was a Jaraï man named Né Louet. Né Louet had joined the CIDG early and quickly distinguished himself as a natural leader and fearless fighter. He rose through the ranks to become a battalion commander, leading hundreds of Montagnard fighters in operations throughout the Highlands. American advisors who worked with Né Louet described him as one of the finest combat leaders they had ever encountered, regardless of nationality. Né Louet embodied the qualities that made the Montagnards such valuable allies. He was brave to the point of recklessness, personally leading assaults and refusing to ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. He was deeply loyal to his American advisors and to his Montagnard fighters. He was skilled in both traditional Montagnard warfare and modern military tactics, and he inspired fierce devotion in his men, who would follow him anywhere. Stories of Né Louet's exploits spread throughout the Central Highlands, making him a hero to the Montagnard people. But the relationship between the Americans and the Montagnards was not without complications. The South Vietnamese government deeply resented the American alliance with the Montagnards. Vietnamese officials viewed the CIDG program as creating an armed Montagnard force that could potentially be used against South Vietnamese authority. There were constant tensions between the Americans who wanted to arm and support the Montagnards and the South Vietnamese, who wanted to keep the Montagnards weak and dependent. These tensions occasionally erupted into violence. In September 1964, Montagnard CIDG fighters staged a revolt against South Vietnamese authority. The uprising was triggered by South Vietnamese abuse and mistreatment of Montagnards, including the killing of several Montagnard leaders. Montagnard fighters seized several CIDG camps and killed dozens of South Vietnamese soldiers and officials. They demanded autonomy for the Highlands and an end to Vietnamese colonization of their lands. The revolt put the Americans in an impossible position. The Montagnards were their allies and partners, and American sympathies were largely with the Montagnards, who had legitimate grievances. But the United States was committed to supporting the South Vietnamese government, and the revolt threatened that alliance. American Special Forces officers, including some who had been taken prisoner by the Montagnard rebels, worked frantically to negotiate a resolution. After tense negotiations, the revolt was peacefully resolved. The Montagnards agreed to return to South Vietnamese authority in exchange for promises of better treatment and greater autonomy. The South Vietnamese government agreed to address Montagnard grievances and to recognize Montagnard cultural rights. But in reality, little changed. The South Vietnamese continued to mistreat the Montagnards, and Montagnard resentment continued to simmer. The 1964 revolt revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the American-Montagnard alliance. The Montagnards fought alongside the Americans not because they supported South Vietnam, but because they hoped the Americans would protect them from all Vietnamese, whether communist or anti-communist. The Americans wanted the Montagnards to fight for South Vietnam, but the Montagnards had no loyalty to Saigon. They fought for their families, their villages, and their American allies. This disconnect would create ongoing tensions throughout the war. Despite these complications, the American-Montagnard alliance continued to grow stronger. By 1965, as the United States committed large numbers of conventional combat forces to Vietnam, the CIDG program had become an established and essential part of American strategy in the Highlands. The Montagnards controlled much of the rural highlands and provided crucial intelligence on communist infiltration routes and base areas. The expansion of the war brought new challenges and opportunities for the Montagnards. As more American units deployed to Vietnam, more resources became available for the CIDG program. The camps were expanded and improved, more weapons and equipment were provided, medical care and other services improved. The Montagnards found themselves at the center of an enormous American military effort, but the expansion of the war also brought more danger. The North Vietnamese army began deploying regular units to the Central Highlands in large numbers. These were not local Viet Cong guerrillas, but professional soldiers with modern weapons and training. The NVA came south down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, in trucks and on foot, carrying heavy weapons and supplies, intent on cutting South Vietnam in half through the highlands. The CIDG camps found themselves facing increasingly sophisticated and determined attacks. The years 1965 through 1968 marked the peak of American involvement in Vietnam and the height of the Montagnard contribution to the war effort. During this period, CIDG camps throughout the Central Highlands became focal points of intense combat as North Vietnamese forces attempted to seize control of the highlands and cut South Vietnam's interior from the coast. One of the first major battles demonstrating Montagnard courage and fighting ability occurred at Camp Plei My in October 1965. Plei My was a CIDG camp located near the Cambodian border in Pleiku Province. Manned by 12 American Special Forces soldiers and approximately 400 Montagnard fighters, mostly Jarai. The camp's isolated position made it strategically important for monitoring infiltration from Cambodia, but it also made it vulnerable to attack. In late October, North Vietnamese intelligence identified Plei My as a target. The NVA massed several battalions, perhaps 2,000 soldiers, in the jungles surrounding the camp. They planned a coordinated assault designed to overrun the camp quickly before reinforcements could arrive. The attack began with a massive mortar and rocket barrage in the pre-dawn darkness, followed by ground assaults from multiple directions. The defenders of Plei My found themselves in a desperate fight for survival. The North Vietnamese attacked in human waves, overwhelming some defensive positions through sheer numbers. The Montagnard fighters, alongside their American advisors, fought with incredible determination. They held their positions under withering fire, counterattacked when the enemy broke through the perimeter, and refused to give ground even when the situation seemed hopeless. The battle raged for days. North Vietnamese forces completely surrounded the camp, cutting it off from ground reinforcement. The only link to the outside world was by radio and helicopter. American aircraft flew constant missions, dropping supplies and evacuating wounded, often under heavy fire. The defenders were running low on ammunition and medical supplies. Casualties mounted on both sides. Inside the camp, the Montagnard fighters displayed the qualities that would make them legendary. They fought from bunkers and trenches, repelling assault after assault. When ammunition ran low, they fought with knives and bare hands. The wounded refused evacuation, insisting on remaining in the fight. Their American advisors, exhausted and amazed by Montagnard courage, fought alongside them, calling in airstrikes and artillery to break up enemy attacks. After nearly a week of siege, a relief force of South Vietnamese armor and American helicopters fought their way to Plei My. The North Vietnamese, having failed to overrun the camp and suffering heavy casualties from American air power, withdrew into Cambodia. The siege was lifted. The camp had held, but at tremendous cost. Dozens of Montagnard defenders had been killed and many more wounded. The camp itself was heavily damaged, with bunkers destroyed and buildings burned. The defense of Plei My became legendary in special forces circles. It demonstrated that even heavily outnumbered, Montagnard fighters with good leadership and air support could hold out against overwhelming North Vietnamese assaults. The battle also led directly to one of the first major engagements between American conventional forces and the North Vietnamese Army, the Battle of Ia Drang Valley, which occurred just weeks later as American forces pursued the NVA units that had attacked Plei My. But while Plei My had held, other camps were not so fortunate. In the years that followed, several CIDG camps throughout the highlands were overrun by North Vietnamese forces. These battles followed a similar pattern. The camps would be surrounded and subjected to days or weeks of siege. Cut off from ground reinforcement and supplied only by air, the defenders would fight desperately, as ammunition and food ran low. Sometimes relief forces would arrive in time, sometimes they didn't. When camps fell, the consequences for the Montagnard defenders were often tragic. The North Vietnamese showed little mercy to captured Montagnard fighters. Many were executed on the spot. Others were taken as prisoners and subjected to brutal treatment. The communists viewed the Montagnards who fought for the Americans as traitors, and they treated them accordingly. This knowledge made Montagnard fighters all the more determined never to surrender. One of the most tragic losses occurred at Camp Lang Vây in February 1968. Lang Vây was located near the Laosian border, very close to the Marine base at Khe Sanh, which was under siege at the time. The camp was manned by 24 American Special Forces soldiers and several hundred Montagnard fighters. In the early morning hours of February 7th, North Vietnamese forces attacked Lang Vây with tanks. This was the first time the North Vietnamese had used tanks in the south, and the shock was total. The defenders of Lang Vây had anti-tank weapons, but they had never trained for an armored assault. Soviet-made PT-76 tanks crashed through the perimeter wire and began systematically destroying the camp's defensive positions. Behind the tanks came waves of North Vietnamese infantry. The battle for Lang Vây was short and brutal. The camp was simply overwhelmed. The Montagnard fighters fought bravely, trying to stop the tanks with recoilless rifles and light anti-tank weapons, but they couldn't hold back the armored assault. Within hours, the camp was overrun. Many of the American advisors managed to escape to Khe Sanh. Most of the Montagnard defenders were not so lucky. Hundreds were killed in the fighting or captured by the North Vietnamese. Those captured faced uncertain fates. The fall of Lang Vây was a devastating blow to Montagnard morale. It demonstrated that even the best defended camps could be overrun if the enemy was willing to commit sufficient forces and modern weapons. It also revealed the limits of American support. The Marines at Khe Sanh, just a few miles away, had not attempted a ground relief of Lang Vây. They were under siege themselves and couldn't spare forces for a risky relief operation. The Montagnards felt abandoned. Despite setbacks like Lang Vây, the CIDG program continued to expand and evolve. New camps were built to replace those that were lost. Training improved as lessons were learned from each battle. The Montagnard forces became more sophisticated in their tactics and better equipped with modern weapons. By 1967 and 1968, some CIDG units were as well trained and equipped as regular South Vietnamese or American units. The mobile strike forces, the elite Montagnard quick reaction battalions, became particularly effective. These units were capable of sustained operations deep in enemy territory. They conducted long-range, reconnaissance patrols, gathering intelligence on North Vietnamese movements and base areas. They ambushed enemy supply columns moving down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They reinforced camps under attack, arriving by helicopter to turn the tide of battle. The Mike forces represented the pinnacle of American Montagnard cooperation. One Mike Force commander who became legendary was the American captain named Roger Donlon. Donlon was one of the first recipients of the Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War for his actions defending Nam Dong Camp in 1964. But his fame among the Montagnards came from his leadership of a Mike Force battalion in the years that followed. Donlon led his Montagnard fighters on dozens of operations, personally leading from the front and earning their absolute loyalty through his courage and respect for their culture. The Montagnards who served under officers like Donlon developed an almost mystical faith in their American leaders. They believed the Americans would never abandon them, that they would always come through when needed. This faith was based on experience. Time after time, American advisors had fought alongside their Montagnard troops, shared their dangers, and proved their commitment. The bonds formed in combat created loyalties that went far beyond military duty. But these bonds also created obligations. The American Special Forces soldiers who worked with the Montagnards felt a deep sense of responsibility to their indigenous allies. They knew the Montagnards were fighting not just for South Vietnam, but because of their personal relationships with individual Americans. This created a moral burden. The Americans knew that if the war went badly, if America withdrew, the Montagnards would be left vulnerable to retribution from both the Communists and the South Vietnamese. This concern was not hypothetical. Even during the war, the South Vietnamese government continued to mistreat the Montagnards. Vietnamese officials embezzled pay meant for Montagnard fighters. They stole supplies intended for CIDG camps. They continued to seize Montagnard lands for Vietnamese colonization. South Vietnamese officers who commanded Montagnard units often treated their soldiers with contempt and sent them on suicide missions to avoid risking Vietnamese lives. The Montagnards endured this treatment because of their loyalty to the Americans, but resentment simmered. The cultural gulf between the Montagnards and the Vietnamese remained unbridgeable. The Vietnamese continued to view the Montagnards as primitive savages barely worthy of consideration. The Montagnards viewed the Vietnamese as arrogant oppressors who had stolen their lands and destroyed their way of life. The Americans found themselves constantly mediating between these two groups who were supposed to be allies, but who actually despised each other. Despite these tensions, the tactical performance of Montagnard units remained excellent. In combat, they were consistently aggressive, courageous, and effective. American commanders learned they could count on Montagnard units to accomplish difficult missions that other units might refuse or fail to complete. The Montagnards' knowledge of the jungle terrain and their tracking skills made them invaluable for operations in the dense forests of the Highlands. One area where Montagnards particularly excelled was in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Their ability to move silently through the jungle and their intimate knowledge of the terrain made them ideal for long-range patrols deep into enemy territory. Montagnard reconnaissance teams, accompanied by American advisors, would infiltrate far behind enemy lines, sometimes staying out for weeks at a time, gathering intelligence on North Vietnamese movements and calling in airstrikes on enemy positions. These reconnaissance missions were extraordinarily dangerous. The teams operated in small groups, typically 6 to 12 men, far from any support. If they were discovered by the enemy, they would be hopelessly outnumbered and would have to fight their way out or evade pursuit through the jungle. Many teams didn't make it back, but the intelligence they gathered was invaluable, providing American commanders with crucial information about enemy strength and intentions. The Montagnards also proved adept at ambush tactics. They would set up along known enemy infiltration routes and wait, sometimes for days, until an enemy unit walked into the kill zone. Then they would unleash devastating fire from concealed positions, inflicting maximum casualties before quickly withdrawing into the jungle. These ambushes kept the North Vietnamese off balance and made their movement through the highlands dangerous and costly. But perhaps the most important contribution of the Montagnards was simply denying the Central Highlands to communist control. The CIDG camps and the areas they protected represented islands of government control in a sea of contested territory. Villages protected by CIDG forces could not be used by the communists as supply bases or recruiting grounds. Trails monitored by Montagnard patrols could not be used safely by enemy forces. The Montagnards essentially held the highlands for the Americans and South Vietnamese, preventing the communists from establishing the secure base areas they needed. This holding action came at tremendous cost. Montagnard casualties were staggering. Exact figures are impossible to determine, but it's estimated that tens of thousands of Montagnard fighters were killed or wounded during the war. Given the small population of the Central Highlands, this represented a catastrophic loss of young men. Entire villages lost most of their military-age males. Some Montagnard groups lost significant portions of their total population. The impact on Montagnard society was devastating. Traditional social structures were disrupted as young men left their villages for military service. Agriculture suffered as there weren't enough people left to work the fields. The introduction of modern weapons and Western culture undermined traditional customs and beliefs. The war fundamentally transformed Montagnard society in ways that could never be undone. The women and children left behind in Montagnard villages bore their own burdens. They lived in constant fear of attack, knowing their villages were targets for communist forces, seeking revenge against families of CIDG fighters. They struggled to maintain their traditional way of life while their men were away fighting. They mourned the constant stream of casualties, conducting traditional funeral rites for the dead and caring for the wounded who returned to the villages. The American Special Forces soldiers who worked with the Montagnards witnessed this suffering firsthand. They saw the villages depleted of young men. They attended funerals and participated in traditional mourning ceremonies. They watched Montagnard widows and orphans struggle to survive. Many Special Forces veterans would later say that their time with the Montagnards was the most meaningful, but also the most heartbreaking experience of their lives. As the war progressed through the late 1960s, the strategic situation in the Central Highlands began to change. The North Vietnamese, frustrated by their inability to overrun the CIDG camps, and by the effectiveness of Montagnard fighters, shifted tactics. Instead of trying to destroy the camps through frontal assaults, they increasingly bypassed them, using routes farther west along the Laotian and Cambodian borders, where there were fewer camps and less surveillance. This shift made the CIDG program less central to American strategy. Conventional American combat units were now handling much of the fighting in the highlands. The role of CIDG forces increasingly became village defense and local security rather than offensive operations against major enemy units. Some American officials began questioning whether the CIDG program should be continued or whether it should be transferred entirely to South Vietnamese control. This discussion alarmed both the Montagnards and the American Special Forces advisors who worked with them. The Montagnards feared that transfer to Vietnamese control would mean the end of their special relationship with the Americans, and would leave them vulnerable to Vietnamese abuse and exploitation. The Special Forces officers knew that the South Vietnamese couldn't be trusted to maintain the program or to treat the Montagnards fairly. But by 1969, the decision had been made. As part of the broader Vietnamization policy, turning the war over to South Vietnamese forces as American troops withdrew, the CIDG program would be converted to South Vietnamese control. The camps would be turned over to the South Vietnamese military. The Montagnard fighters would become part of the South Vietnamese regional forces rather than remaining a separate force under American advisors. The implementation of this policy was traumatic for both the Montagnards and their American advisors. Conversion ceremonies were held at camps throughout the highlands, where the American flag was lowered and the South Vietnamese flag raised. Montagnard fighters were told they now served the Saigon government rather than the Americans. The Special Forces advisors who had lived and fought with the Montagnards for years said goodbye and turned their Montagnard brothers over to Vietnamese officers who had no understanding of or respect for Montagnard culture. Many Montagnards felt betrayed by this transition. They had fought loyally for the Americans, suffered terrible casualties, and sacrificed their traditional way of life. Now they were being handed over to the Vietnamese government they had always distrusted and who had always mistreated them. Some Montagnards deserted rather than serve under Vietnamese command. Others continued to serve, but with greatly diminished morale and effectiveness. The conversion of the CIDG program marked the beginning of the end of the American Montagnard Alliance. As American forces withdrew from Vietnam in the early 1970s, the Montagnards found themselves increasingly isolated and vulnerable. The South Vietnamese government, no longer restrained by American oversight, became more openly hostile to Montagnard autonomy. The old patterns of land seizures, cultural oppression, and discrimination intensified. Meanwhile, communist forces, sensing the changing tide of the war, increased their pressure on the highlands. The North Vietnamese knew that the Montagnards had been among their most effective enemies. They were determined to punish the Montagnards and to ensure they could never again serve as a base for resistance to communist control. Villages were targeted for attack. Montagnard leaders were assassinated. Psychological operations attempted to convince Montagnards that the communists had won and that further resistance was futile. Some Montagnard groups, seeing the writing on the wall, began to make accommodations with the communists. They calculated that survival required switching sides, or at least remaining neutral. But many Montagnards, particularly those who had served in the CIDG and Mike forces, remained committed to resistance. They had fought the communists for too long, lost too many friends and family members, to simply give up now. These loyalist Montagnards continued fighting even as the strategic situation deteriorated. They conducted guerrilla operations against communist forces. They protected villages still under government control. They gathered intelligence and passed it to South Vietnamese and remaining American advisors. They held out hope that somehow, some way, the Americans would return and honor the commitments that had been made to the Montagnard people. But the Americans were not coming back. By 1972, virtually all American ground combat forces had withdrawn from Vietnam. Only a small number of advisors remained. American air power continued to support South Vietnamese forces, but it was clear that the United States was disengaging from the war. The Montagnards were on their own. The final years of the war, from 1972 to 1975, were a period of slow collapse for South Vietnam and increasing desperation for the Montagnards. The Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973 officially ended American involvement in the war, though North Vietnamese forces remained in the south, and the fighting continued between South Vietnamese and communist forces. For the Montagnards, the American withdrawal was a catastrophe. The special relationship they had enjoyed with American forces was gone. They now served under South Vietnamese commanders, who viewed them with suspicion and contempt. The equipment and supplies that had once flowed freely from American sources dried up. Medical care declined. Pay was irregular. Training and support stopped. The Montagnard units that had once been among the most effective fighting forces in Vietnam were allowed to deteriorate through neglect and mismanagement. The South Vietnamese government, no longer constrained by American pressure to treat the Montagnards decently, reverted to its worst instincts. Land seizures accelerated. Montagnard communities were forced to relocate to make way for Vietnamese colonization. Traditional leaders were arrested or harassed. Vietnamese was enforced as the only official language. The policies of cultural genocide that had been somewhat restrained during the American presence now proceeded with renewed vigor. Many Montagnards who had served in CIDG and Mike Force units found themselves marginalized and persecuted. They had skills and training that made the South Vietnamese government nervous. They were seen as potential rebels, and indeed, some Montagnard veterans did organize resistance movements against South Vietnamese authority. The government responded with repression, arrests, and in some cases, extrajudicial killings of Montagnard leaders. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese were preparing for their final offensive to conquer the South. Throughout 1974, communist forces built up their strength, moving tanks, artillery, and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail in preparation for a massive assault. The Central Highlands were a key objective. The communists knew that if they could seize the highlands, they could cut South Vietnam in two, and the rest of the country would collapse quickly. In March 1975, the North Vietnamese launched their offensive. They struck first in the highlands, overwhelming South Vietnamese defenses in Darlac and Pleiku provinces. The South Vietnamese military, demoralized and poorly led, collapsed almost immediately. Units that had once fought effectively alongside Americans now fled without significant resistance. The Central Highlands fell within days. For the Montagnards, the communist conquest was a nightmare come true. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, having finally won control of the highlands, set about punishing those who had opposed them. Montagnards who had served in the CIDG or Mike forces were particular targets. Many were executed immediately. Others were sent to re-education camps, brutal prison camps where political prisoners were subjected to forced labor, torture, and ideological indoctrination. Entire Montagnard villages that had been associated with the American war effort were destroyed. People were forcibly relocated to new economic zones where they could be more easily controlled. Traditional Montagnard culture was suppressed as the communist government attempted to integrate the highland peoples into Vietnamese society. The autonomy that Montagnards had maintained for centuries was finally crushed. Many Montagnards attempted to flee. Some tried to escape to Cambodia or Laos, only to find that communist forces controlled those countries as well. Others tried to reach the coast and escape by sea, but few succeeded. Most were caught and sent to prison camps. The lucky ones simply disappeared into the remote jungle, attempting to survive by returning to their traditional ways, far from government control. A small number of Montagnards managed to escape to Thailand as refugees. They made harrowing journeys through the jungle, evading patrols and checkpoints, crossing the Mekong River at night. Those who reached Thailand were placed in refugee camps where they waited, often for years, for the chance to resettle in a third country. Some eventually made it to the United States, France, or other Western nations willing to accept Vietnamese refugees. The Montagnards who reached America brought with them traumatic memories and profound sense of betrayal. They had fought loyally for the United States, believing the promises made by American soldiers and officials. They had been told that if they fought alongside America, they would be protected and rewarded. Instead, they had been abandoned, left to face terrible retribution from the communists and the Vietnamese government that preceded them. The American Special Forces veterans who had worked with the Montagnards were equally devastated by what happened. Many felt they had made personal commitments to their Montagnard friends and allies, commitments they had been unable to keep. They watched from afar as the people they had lived and fought with suffered persecution and death. Some veterans spent years trying to help Montagnard refugees, sponsoring them for immigration, providing support when they arrived in America, and advocating for better treatment of Montagnards still in Vietnam. In the years immediately following the fall of Saigon, reliable information about conditions in the Central Highlands was scarce. The communist government tightly controlled access to the region and suppressed news of what was happening to the Montagnards. But gradually, through refugee accounts and other sources, a picture emerged of systematic persecution. The communist government implemented policies designed to break up traditional Montagnard communities and integrate them into Vietnamese society. Villages were destroyed and people relocated to new settlements where they could be more easily monitored. Traditional leaders were removed from power and replaced with Communist Party officials. Traditional religious practices were banned as superstition and backwardness. Children were required to attend Vietnamese schools, where their native languages and customs were denigrated. Land that had belonged to Montagnard communities for generations was seized by the state and redistributed to Vietnamese settlers from the crowded lowlands. The Vietnamese colonization of the highlands that had begun under the Saigon government accelerated under communist rule. Montagnards were reduced to a minority in their own homeland, economically marginalized and politically powerless. Those Montagnards who had served in the CIDG or other American allied forces faced the harshest treatment. Thousands were sent to re-education camps where they were subjected to brutal conditions, forced labor, inadequate food and medical care, and constant political indoctrination. Many died in these camps from disease, starvation, or abuse. Those who survived emerged broken, their health shattered, their spirits crushed. The persecution wasn't limited to former fighters. Family members of those who had worked with Americans were also targeted. Children were denied education and employment opportunities because of their family background. Wives of former CIDG fighters were harassed and discriminated against. The communist government's policy seemed designed not just to punish those who had fought against them, but to destroy any memory of the American Montagnard alliance. Some Montagnards refused to submit to communist rule. Small groups of fighters, veterans of the CIDG and Mike forces, retreated into the remote jungle and continued resistance. These groups conducted sporadic guerrilla operations against government forces, ambushing patrols, attacking outposts, and trying to disrupt the government's control of the highlands. They held out hope that somehow international pressure or changing political circumstances would bring about better conditions for the Montagnard people. The most significant of these resistance movements was called FULRO, an acronym for Front Unifié de Lutte des Races Opprimées, or United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races. FULRO had existed since the 1960s as a political movement advocating for Montagnard autonomy. After 1975, FULRO became an armed resistance movement. Several hundred Montagnard fighters, many of them CIDG veterans, continued fighting under the FULRO banner well into the 1980s. The FULRO fighters operated from bases in the remote jungle along the Cambodian border. They had limited weapons and supplies, mostly what they had managed to hide or capture. They couldn't hope to defeat the Vietnamese government militarily. Their struggle was about survival and maintaining their identity as a distinct people. They refused to be absorbed into Vietnamese society. They continued to practice their traditional customs and speak their native languages. And they never forgot the Americans who had once fought alongside them. Throughout the 1980s, FULRO maintained sporadic radio contact with the outside world. Their messages, broadcast in broken English, pleaded for international support and told of the continuing persecution of the Montagnard people. Some American veterans who heard these broadcasts were moved to try to help, but there was little they could do. The United States had normalized relations with Vietnam and had no interest in supporting insurgent movements there. Gradually, the FULRO resistance was worn down. Government forces pursued them relentlessly. Their numbers dwindled through casualties, desertions, and simple attrition. Supplies became increasingly scarce. By the early 1990s, only a few dozen fighters remained. In 1992, the last FULRO fighters, about 400 men, women, and children, emerged from the jungle and surrendered to United Nations peacekeepers in Cambodia. They had held out for 17 years after the end of the war, surviving in the jungle, maintaining their resistance, and refusing to give up their identity. The FULRO survivors who surrendered in Cambodia were eventually resettled in the United States as refugees. They joined the small but growing Montagnard diaspora community in America. These communities, primarily in North Carolina, but also in other states, became home to thousands of Montagnard refugees who had escaped Vietnam over the years. They tried to maintain their traditional culture while adapting to life in America, a balancing act that was often difficult for people from such different backgrounds. Back in Vietnam, conditions for Montagnards remained difficult. The communist government gradually relaxed some of its harshest policies, but systematic discrimination continued. Montagnards remained among the poorest and most marginalized people in Vietnam. They had limited access to education and health care. Economic opportunities were scarce. Land rights remained contested. And any attempt to organize politically or to advocate for Montagnard rights was met with harsh repression. In the 2000s, there were several protests and uprisings by Montagnards demanding better treatment and respect for their rights. These protests were brutally suppressed by Vietnamese security forces. Hundreds of Montagnards were arrested. Many were beaten or tortured. Some simply disappeared. The protests gained international attention and highlighted the continuing persecution of the Montagnards, but they resulted in little concrete improvement in their conditions. The Vietnamese government's official position was that the Montagnards, along with other ethnic minorities, were equal citizens of Vietnam with full rights. The reality was very different. The Montagnards were treated as second-class citizens at best. Their culture was viewed as backward and in need of modernization, which meant Vietnamization. Their traditional territories continued to be seized for development projects, logging, and Vietnamese settlement. They had little political voice or power to resist these encroachments. The legacy of the American Montagnard Alliance remains controversial and painful. From the American perspective, the Montagnards were loyal allies who fought bravely and suffered terribly. They deserved better than to be abandoned when America withdrew from Vietnam. Many American veterans, particularly Special Forces soldiers who worked with Montagnards, have spent decades advocating for Montagnard rights and trying to help Montagnard refugees. From the Vietnamese government's perspective, the Montagnards who worked with Americans were traitors who fought against Vietnamese independence and unity. They collaborated with foreign invaders and therefore deserved to be punished when the rightful government prevailed. This perspective justifies the harsh treatment Montagnards received after 1975. From the Montagnard perspective, they were simply trying to survive and protect their way of life in a conflict that was not of their making. They allied with the Americans because the Americans treated them with respect and promised to protect them from Vietnamese encroachment. When the Americans left and those promises proved empty, the Montagnards paid a terrible price. The Montagnard experience raises profound questions about the morality of recruiting Indigenous peoples as allies in conflicts where the outcome is uncertain. The United States gained significant military benefits from the Montagnard alliance. Thousands of Montagnard fighters served effectively in some of the most dangerous areas of Vietnam. They provided crucial intelligence, controlled territory, and tied down enemy forces. Their contribution to the American war effort was substantial. But what did the Montagnards gain? Tens of thousands died. Their society was fundamentally disrupted. Their traditional way of life was destroyed. When the war ended, they faced persecution and oppression worse than what they had experienced before. Many were killed or imprisoned. Others were driven into exile. Those who remained in Vietnam continued to face discrimination and marginalization. The alliance with America, from a Montagnard perspective, was a catastrophe. Could things have been different? Some argue that if the United States had won the war, or at least prevented North Vietnam from conquering the South, the Montagnards would have fared better. But this assumes that the South Vietnamese government would have treated the Montagnards better after an American victory, which seems unlikely given their behavior during the war. Others argue that the United States should have done more to protect Montagnard refugees after the war ended, allowing more to resettle in America. This certainly would have helped those who escaped, though it wouldn't have addressed the situation of those who remained in Vietnam. The fundamental problem was that the Montagnards were recruited into a war based on promises that America could not or would not keep. They were promised protection and autonomy, but these promises depended on factors beyond American control, particularly South Vietnamese behavior and the ultimate outcome of the war. When things went badly, the Montagnards bore the consequences while America simply walked away. This pattern of recruiting Indigenous allies and then abandoning them when politically convenient has repeated throughout American military history. Native Americans who allied with the United States in various conflicts, Filipino irregulars who fought alongside Americans, Iraqi and Afghan interpreters and militias, all have experienced versions of what happened to the Montagnards. The pattern raises serious ethical questions about the responsibility that powerful nations have to their weaker allies. For the American veterans who worked with the Montagnards, the sense of betrayal and guilt has been enduring. Many have dedicated their lives to helping Montagnard refugees and advocating for those still in Vietnam. They have written books, given interviews, and lobbied Congress to recognize the Montagnard contribution and to provide assistance. They have maintained personal relationships with their Montagnard friends who made it to America, attending weddings and funerals, helping with adjustment to American life, and keeping alive the memory of what they shared together. These veterans speak of the Montagnards with deep respect and affection. They describe them as the finest soldiers they ever worked with, brave, loyal, and skilled. They talk about the bonds formed in combat, the shared hardships, and the mutual respect that transcended cultural differences. And they express profound regret about what happened after America withdrew, about the betrayal they feel they were forced to participate in, about the friends they couldn't save. The Montagnards who came to America as refugees faced enormous challenges adapting to a completely different culture. They came from traditional societies where extended families lived together in longhouses, where agriculture and hunting were the primary means of survival, where animistic spiritual beliefs shaped daily life. They found themselves in modern American cities, working in factories or service industries, trying to raise children in a culture that seemed alien, and sometimes hostile. Many Montagnard refugees struggled with trauma from the war and its aftermath. They had witnessed terrible violence, They had lost family members. They had endured persecution and imprisonment. They carried psychological scars that made adjustment to normal life difficult. Depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress were common. Language barriers made it hard to access mental health services even when they wanted help. Despite these challenges, the Montagnard community in America has persevered. They have established cultural organizations to preserve their traditions and teach their languages to younger generations. They hold festivals and ceremonies that maintain connections to their heritage. They have built churches, as many Montagnards converted to Christianity through missionary contact, and these churches serve as community centers. They support each other through the difficulties of life in a new country. The younger generation of Montagnards born or raised in America faces its own challenges. They live between two cultures, American and Montagnard, often feeling fully part of neither. They may speak English better than their native language. They are educated in American schools and adopt American customs. But they also feel the weight of their parents' history and trauma. They carry the knowledge of what their people suffered and what was lost. Many struggle to find their identity and place in a society that knows little about Montagnards or their history. Some young Montagnards have become advocates for their community, using their American education and skills to fight for Montagnard rights both in America and in Vietnam. They have formed organizations that monitor human rights conditions in the Central Highlands and publicize abuses. They lobby American politicians to pressure Vietnam on Montagnard issues. They work to educate Americans about Montagnard history and culture. They are trying to ensure that their people's story is not forgotten, and that the sacrifices made were not in vain. In Vietnam today, the situation of the Montagnards remains precarious. The Vietnamese government has made some efforts at economic development in the highlands, but Montagnards have benefited little from this development. Much of it involves resource extraction, logging, and mining that destroys traditional Montagnard lands while providing few jobs or benefits to local people. Vietnamese migrants continue to move into the highlands, and Montagnards continue to be displaced from their ancestral territories. Religious persecution remains a significant issue. Many Montagnards converted to Protestant Christianity during and after the war. The Vietnamese government views these Christian communities with suspicion, seeing them as potential centers of political opposition. House churches are raided, religious leaders are arrested. Montagnards who practice their traditional animistic beliefs face less direct persecution, but are still viewed as backward and primitive. Human rights organizations continue to document abuses against Montagnards. Arbitrary arrests, torture and detention, land seizures, and discrimination in education and employment are ongoing problems. Montagnards who speak out about these issues face retaliation. Some have been imprisoned on charges of undermining the state or threatening national security. The message from the Vietnamese government is clear. Montagnards should accept their subordinate status and assimilate into Vietnamese society or face consequences. Despite this oppression, the Montagnard people endure. They have survived centuries of pressure from more powerful neighbors. They maintain their distinct identity through French colonialism, the American War, and communist rule. Their culture has been damaged and their population decimated, but they persist. In remote areas of the highlands, Montagnard communities still practice traditional agriculture and maintain traditional customs. They speak their native languages among themselves. They remember their history and pass it on to their children. They refuse to disappear. The story of the Montagnards and their alliance with America during the Vietnam War is ultimately a tragic one. It is a story of courage and loyalty, of bonds formed in combat and friendships that transcended cultural divides. It is a story of people who fought bravely for what they believed was right and suffered terribly as a consequence. It is a story of promises made and broken, of allies abandoned, and of a people betrayed. But it is also a story that demands to be remembered and learned from. The Montagnards paid an enormous price for their alliance with the United States. They deserve to have their story told and their sacrifices recognized. The American veterans who fought alongside them and the Montagnard refugees who made it to America have worked to keep this memory alive. They know that forgetting what happened to the Montagnards means risking repeating the same betrayal with other Indigenous allies in future conflicts. The lessons of the Montagnard experience are clear. When powerful nations recruit weaker allies, they incur moral obligations to those allies. These obligations don't end when the immediate military need is satisfied, or when political circumstances change. The United States asked the Montagnards to fight and to risk everything. When they did so, America became responsible for what happened to them. That responsibility was not adequately fulfilled. Future policymakers considering similar alliances should remember the Montagnards. They should ask whether they are prepared to fulfill the obligations that such alliances create. They should consider what will happen to Indigenous allies if things go badly. They should plan for contingencies including resettlement of refugees and long-term support. And they should be honest with potential allies about the risks and about whether America can actually deliver on its promises. The Montagnards also teach us about the human capacity for courage and loyalty, even in the face of betrayal. Despite being abandoned by America, despite suffering terrible persecution, many Montagnard veterans maintain affection and loyalty toward the American soldiers they fought alongside. They don't blame individual Americans for what happened. They understand that their Special Forces advisors and other American friends did what they could, and that larger political forces beyond anyone's control determined the final outcome. This grace and forgiveness is humbling. The Montagnards had every reason to be bitter and angry. Many are. But many also choose to remember the good times, the bonds of brotherhood, the mutual respect and affection. They choose to honor the memory of Americans who died fighting alongside them. They choose to maintain relationships with American veterans who have continued to support them. This speaks to a nobility of character that demands respect and admiration. As we look back more than half a century after the height of the American Montagnard Alliance, we can see this history from a longer perspective. The immediate military outcomes of the Vietnam War are settled. North Vietnam won, South Vietnam fell. The Americans went home, but the human consequences continue to reverberate. The Montagnards in Vietnam still face discrimination and persecution. The Montagnard diaspora in America still struggles with the trauma of war and exile. The American veterans still carry guilt and sorrow about what happened to their allies. The Montagnard experience is a reminder that the effects of war extend far beyond battlefield victories and defeats. Wars reshape societies, destroy cultures, create refugees, and generate trauma that lasts for generations. The decisions made by political and military leaders in comfortable offices have profound human consequences for people in distant places. Those consequences deserve to be considered seriously before conflicts begin, not as afterthoughts when wars end badly. Today, the Montagnard people continue their struggle for survival and dignity. In Vietnam, they fight against cultural extinction and for basic human rights. In America and other countries of refuge, they work to preserve their heritage while building new lives. They remember their history, both the proud tradition of warrior culture and the tragic outcome of their alliance with America. They hope that future generations will not forget who they are and what they endured. For Americans, especially American veterans, the Montagnards represent a debt unpaid and a lesson unlearned. The debt is to the people who fought loyally and suffered grievously for their alliance with America. That debt can never be fully repaid, but it can be acknowledged. The lesson is about the moral weight of recruiting allies and the obligation such recruitment creates. That lesson should inform future decisions about when and how America enters into such relationships. The story of the Montagnard warriors and their alliance with the United States in the Central Highlands of Vietnam is a story that needs to be told and retold. It is a story of human courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story of loyalty that endured beyond betrayal. It is a story of a people who sacrificed everything and gained almost nothing. It is a story that honors those who served and mourns what was lost. And it is a story that warns us about the human cost of war and the weight of promises made to those who fight beside us. The Montagnards deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to the Vietnam War, but as central players in that conflict. They were warriors who fought with extraordinary courage. They were allies who demonstrated remarkable loyalty. They were human beings with their own culture, dreams, and rights who became caught up in forces beyond their control. Their story is American history because America made it so by recruiting them as allies. We cannot tell the full story of the Vietnam War without telling their story. And we cannot understand the moral complexities of that war without grappling with what happened to the Montagnards and what America's responsibility was and is to them. So, we remember the Montagnards who fought in the Central Highlands. We remember their villages in the misty mountains, their long houses and rice fields, their traditions and beliefs. We remember the CIDG camps scattered throughout the Highlands, the Americans and Montagnards who manned them together. We remember the battles fought and the casualties suffered. We remember names like Play May and Lang Vei and Buona Now. We remember leaders like Nay Louette and countless others whose names have been lost to history. We remember the refugees who made it to America and those who didn't. We remember those who died in re-education camps and those who fought on long after the war officially ended. We remember the Special Forces soldiers who loved their Montagnard brothers and who have never stopped fighting for them. And in remembering, we honor them. We honor their courage, their loyalty, and their sacrifice. We acknowledge the debt America owes them, and the tragedy of how that debt remains largely unpaid. We commit to telling their story so that future generations will know what they did and what happened to them. And we hold on to the hope that somehow, someday, the Montagnard people will find the justice, dignity, and peace that they have been denied for so long. That is the least we can do for the warriors of the Central Highlands who stood with America when we asked them to stand with us.